Welcome to our latest interview in our Book Reporter Talks To series, where we're doing something different today. I am pleased to have as our guests Suzanne Skyvara, who is the Vice President of Marketing and Editorial for Goodreads, and Danny Feekes, who is their Managing Editor. Suzanne and I met a few years ago on the floor of Book Expo, and it went something like this. It's a very crowded floor, lots going on. I walked up and said, "Your presentation this morning was great." And she said, "Who are you?" And I told her my name, and she said, "I read the Book Reporter newsletter every week." And then she knew too much about me, and I had to get to know lots more about her. So that was like really, really fun. So many of our readers are big fans of Goodreads. We know that. They go out and they post about their books on Goodreads. They go out there to look for titles. So Suzanne approached me a couple of weeks ago and said, why don't we get together and talk? And I said, that'll be great, because we've got pages out there with suggestions for mystery thriller, historical fiction, and biography and memoir. So Suzanne usually comes to my office and we sit down and have these dishy conversations about books. So we're inviting Danny into our dishy conversation today too. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about early summer reads that are out now through mid-June. So the books that we're talking about, it's not like they're way off in the distance like you often hear on a preview. Where there are things that are bubbling up with Goodreads readers that you may not be hearing about. Like, we're going to give us some inside track instead of just everything that you've been hearing about. And then some of them may be books that we've been talking about on the site as well, and we'll see how those collide. So welcome, Suzanne and Danny. It is so nice to have you with us today.
Thank you. That's just an amazing intro. And yes, I always love talking with you, Carol. I think I came over to your office one time and I was only meant to be there for about half an hour. And an hour later, we were still talking as we headed out. It was an amazing, because you just know so much about books. It's wonderful to connect with you.
But we joked that we should have had wine. And we said the next time we were going to have wine. That was the one thing that was missing. That was missing. So,
we're all at home. Why are we not having wine right now, you all?
It's really so early excited. There, or I would suggest it.
It's 10:45, but what is time right now? I am so elated to be here. I can't wait to talk books. It's my favorite thing.
And as we're getting started, we have a lot of readers who are on Goodreads, but not everyone is. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Goodreads and what you both do there? Because I think that would be interesting for them to hear as well.
Absolutely. So Goodreads is the world's largest site for reading and book recommendations. So we have 105 million members. It's totally free to use. And our mission is to help people discover more books they love and get more out of reading. And my job at Goodreads is to help more people discover Goodreads, market Goodreads. And then I work with Editorial, which is Danny's domain. So I'm going to let him speak about that. But just a little bit more about Goodreads is that you can use it to, one of my favorite things is the want to read. You can add books that you hear about when you read your Book Reporter newsletter or you're listening to NPR and you go, oh my God, that book sounds amazing, and you don't want to forget it. On Goodreads, you just pull out the app, add it to your want to read shelf, and it's there for when you're at the library or the bookstore or when you're ready to choose a new book to order online. So you can track the books that you're reading. It's really great for that. And there's authors on there and a ton of really interesting editorial content. So over to you, Danny.
Yes, thank you. I'm Danny Feekes. I'm the managing editor, and I oversee our social media accounts, our blog, and our newsletter. And as Suzanne mentioned, the want to read functionality, that's really the bread and butter of what we do at Goodreads. We look at what our community is loving, reading, and rating, and really use that to kind of amplify and showcase books that our community admires. And so what we do is then package it up into newsletters and on our blog and into our social media accounts. And it's just a really fun place for people to learn about new books and talk about books.
And it's also, you learn a lot from your readers all the time. As you know,
absolutely.
When we first started, we had a chat room, and we had one room that was dedicated to the book, The Sparrow, because that many people wanted to talk about the book. And we were saying, we didn't even know who some of these authors were. It was, 1996, who's Janet Ivanovich? Who are these people? And yet you learn a lot from the readers, and it makes it so much more of an interesting experience as well, for you as well as for them.
Absolutely. I cannot tell you how many interesting books that I would never have chosen to read that I've then ended up reading because I work at Goodreads.
Perfect. So let's start out with, just because it's summer, Let's start out with some quintessential beach reads, just because it's that time of year. And this year, I think, beach is kind of a state of mind, because even if you're not leaving your house and going to the beach, you wish you were. So you want to sit there and say, what would I be reading if I was sitting on that beach that I can now read at my house? So Suzanne, what have you got for us?
Oh, okay. So my one is A Bad Day for Sunshine by Darynda Jones. That came out in April, so you should be able to get hold of it easily. And if you liked Gilmore Girls or you're fans of Janet Ivanovich, then this one could really appeal to you. It's really lighthearted and fun, but with a mystery at the heart of it. And it's the summer read you're looking for. So it centers on this character called Sunshine Vikram, who she goes back to her home village of Del Sol in New Mexico with her 14-year-old daughter to start as the sheriff there. And there ends up being a mystery, a sexy old flame, and a wacky cast of secondary characters. But the relationship between the mother and the daughter is so quintessential Gilmore Girls-esque that you just really relate to it and fall instantly in love with them. One Goodreads member said, "This is a great novel to read if you are feeling even a hint of the blues and in need of a lift."
That sounds like perfect. Absolutely perfect. Danny, what have you got for us?
Well, I've got the quintessential beach read. It's called Beach Read.
Oh, perfect.
It is the perfect name, and I think it's the perfect book for right now. It's by author Emily Henry. She's best known for her YA book, A Million Junes. And actually, this book came out in May, and it was our second most anticipated book of the month, right under the Hunger Games prequel. So it's safe to say that people are really clamoring for this book. I started it this week. I'm listening to it. It is delightful. It starts off not delightful. It's based on a romance author who is attending her father's funeral. And at the funeral, she learns that he's had a secret affair and actually owns a secret beach house. So, you know, with mixed emotions, she decides to go to the beach house to work on the novel that's due, her romance book. And sure enough, next door, there is a hunky man who happens to be writing a literary fiction novel, and they both have writer's block. So what do? They swap genres. So she works on the great American novel. He works on a lighthearted romance romp, and hilarity ensues, romance ensues. I haven't made it to the end yet, but I'm hoping for a happily ever after. I feel like I need it right now. But if you can't make it to the actual beach, this is probably the book for you, beach read.
I love it. I love it. I love what they swap. Oh, that's got to be fun. I've got to find that one. Definitely.
Right.
Our readers are big lovers of mysteries and thrillers. So what have you got for us for mysteries and thrillers? Suzanne, you want to start?
I can start there, or
Okay,
Suzanne, you want to go?
Let Danny go. Danny, go first.
Okay. I'll go with a book called Safe. This one is by S.K. Barnett. And this is one of those books that I think the author's story is maybe a little bit even more intriguing than the book itself, but they both are. But S.K. Barnett is a pseudonym, so we don't know if it's a female author or a male author. But what we do know is that one of this person's book has been made into a major motion picture. So color me intrigued. The book itself surrounds, it involves a young girl who's kidnapped from her suburban neighborhood at the age of 6. She's gone. The family is obviously worried. 12 years later, she returns, but there are actually more questions than answers. She's escaped her kidnappers, but is she safe? Hence the title. This, since it's a debut, is really bubbling up high amongst our readers, and they're loving it a lot. And I'm intrigued to find out who the author is.
Is it a British author or is it American? Is it somebody British or American? Do you know?
I don't even know. I just know there's a movie.
Yeah, they haven't actually said. They just give you the clue, major motion picture, and you're like, oh.
oh, this is definitely dishy. And out June 9th. Out June 9th. So
June 9th.
And your readers are loving it. Ooh. Suzanne, what do you have for us?
Okay, so I have a book called The Girl Beneath the Sea by Andrew Mayne. That came out in May, so totally available. And you know all those shots we see in police dramas and in the movies of the divers in the cold, murky water, and they're finding the bodies or the evidence, etc. But we never really know about those people. It's always about the detectives on the land, right? Well, this is a story that's focusing on one of those divers. And not only is she a diver, it's a female diver. So Sloane McPherson is a female evidence recovery diver for the police in Florida. So hopefully the water is a bit warmer there. And she comes from a family of treasure hunters and drug smugglers, amazingly enough. And one day she's diving by herself, which is a no-no, but I guess for the story it works. And her body is dumped in the water near her, like just. And anyhow, she ends up being involved in the case and yet also deputized and put on the case. But the person they put to work with her is someone who absolutely her whole family hates, and she's, you know, just grew up at the idea of him hating him. And so begins this like action-packed whirlwind of a ride. So if you're looking for like a fast-paced thriller with characters that you really enjoy spending time with on a summer afternoon, then check out The Girl Beneath the Sea.
And your readers are really loving this. This is one of those ones that's been bubbling up that we're not hearing a lot about, but they're definitely behind this book.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a lot of people just going, oh my God, I just couldn't put this down, fast paced, just kept me going. And people, it's actually the start of a new series, Underwater Investigations Unit. And I just like that. I like that it's a different character and that it's a strong female lead as well.
And it's a different place. I mean, Underwater is a whole different story. There was the, what's her name? It's Joshua and Jackson's book from last year. And it had an underwater segment to the whole thing. And I was just there. I am not into diving. I'm not into holding my breath. So I could just picture reading that book and saying, I'm holding my breath down there with her, you know, completely there.
The claustrophobia. Yeah.
Totally there. Suzanne, anything else for suspense thriller for you?
Well, this is one that you and I have been sort of talking about, and also readers on Goodreads enjoy, which is Ghosts of Harvard by Francesca Serritella. And this one's hard to categorize, right? So it's part psychological thriller, part ghost story, part mystery. And I believe it's a bets on pick for you guys, right?
It is. And I actually interviewed Francesca a couple of weeks ago. What I really like about the book is it's not definable. And we have so many books where it's this. And it's also a story of what happened on this one college campus to this young girl's brother. He died by suicide. And she now is at Harvard trying to figure out what happened to him and trace his life. There was a brother she loved so much. And I like this book. It's a debut novel. And at the same time, you're trying to figure out which category does it belong in. And I put it in thriller just because you're trying to figure out what happens, but kind of undefinable. But readers are loving that one too, from what I've been seeing on Goodreads.
Yes, and what really stood out to me was reading the reviews. It's one of those ones where the location becomes almost a character as well. Mm-hmm. The way that she writes about Harvard, which is where it's set on, really, she just really knows it and really has researched it, and it really brings it to life in a way that you feel that you're walking around there. Multiple reviews were calling out that about how much they enjoyed that side of it.
Off her 4 years at Harvard because that's where she went to school, so she can write off that was research for 4 years of what to do for writing my book. Are there any other genres that are surprising you right now that, gee, people are reading these and it's surprising us at this point? What have you got?
Yeah, I think people are really wanting an escape right now. So as we talked about, they really are gravitating towards beach reads, mystery thrillers, and sometimes a little even darker. So one of the books that's bubbling up for me is Mexican Gothic. So this is by the author of, her name's Silvia Moreno-Garcia. And this is the author of Gods of Jade and Shadow, which was a fantasy book that came out last year and was actually nominated for a Goodreads Choice Award. So a celebrated author. She decided that she wanted to write a haunted house story, something as the title suggests, very Gothic, Mexican Gothic. And it's a really great premise. It's about a newlywed couple in a new house that write to their cousin and say, and the wife says, "Help, my husband's trying to poison me." So the cousin comes to her aid, moves in with them, and as she's living with them, discovers that the house has a murderous past and is potentially even cursed. So it's leaning horror, but not Stephen King horror. It is more pulpy, kind of pulpy literary fiction. And it was our #4 most anticipated book of June. So I think people that don't typically read in this vein are actually finding a good escape, a fright that is not their own, is what I'm saying.
And it has a gorgeous cover. I saw the cover of that last week during a presentation. I said, oh my gosh, this is just beautiful. It's very, very striking.
Very lush, I agree.
And that one's coming out on June 23rd, so you've got to wait just a little bit longer to get your hands on that one, but put it on your want to read shelf to remind yourself.
But Suzanne, you've got one that's coming sooner that they can pick up right now in that same kind of horror gothic-y kind of vein.
I know. Now, I have to say that I am not a horror reader. I'm just way too imaginative and empathetic, and so I get scared way too easily. But this book was not only really popular with Goodreads members and Bubble, and just really coming up there, getting great reviews, but also the editorial team, Danny and some of the others, were all reading and talking about it. I was like, do you think I can? And they're like, you can do it. So I ended up reading it and I loved it. It's the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, which the title alone has you going, wait, what now?
What?
And that one is, it's kind of described again as fried green tomatoes meets steel magnolias meets Dracula. And it's got a dash of Stepford Wives in there as well. So what it is it's set in the 90s. It's a women's book club in the suburbs in the South. And what they have to do is protect their community from a mysterious and handsome stranger who, yes, turns out to be a blood-sucking fiend. There were definitely some gory bits in there where I was like, flick, let me get through. I'm not going to read those. But that's just for me. Everybody else, go for it. You can deal with it. What I really loved, though, about this story is that it ends up being a story of courageous women who are fighting to protect their families and the community. And it was really inspiring, and I just really enjoyed it. There were so many different elements to it, and it was a fun read, and also just a yes, well done. So great read, the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires.
And it's for courageous book clubs or those who want to be more courageous. Sit down and read. There's a book club's something to take a look at.
And Suzanne's right. We all on the editorial team read this book and we were all obsessed with it. And I agree with Suzanne. I think it's really a book about female friendship more than anything. But more than that, or in addition, it's a really good book for people who love books. Each chapter has a title of a book in cold blood. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus.
Bridges of Madison County. Do you remember the Bridges of Madison County? That was hilarious, that chapter.
It showcases these women in the early 90s reading these books real time, and it's a delight to go on that journey with them. And yes, there are some scary scenes, but you can quickly skip them if you don't like them.
And Danny, I was being really rude. This one's by Grady Hendrix, right? I'm getting the name right?
That's correct, yep.
Yes, because I kept forgetting to say his name, and it's always important to mention the author.
Mention the author as well. But I think that a book club, reading a book about book clubs, that's something that they always enjoy, because they sit there and say, would that be us? Would we have done this? How would we have been? And I like that books are layered in between, because it gives a lot of room for discussion, because a book club could also read along with those books. They can assign one of those books to each member, so that when you're discussing the book, you're also discussing the other book as well. So that could be kind of fun too.
Yeah.
So now we've got historical fiction, and we know readers love that. So what have we got for them for historical fiction?
Do you want to start, Suzanne?
Yeah, I'm like scanning quickly. Oh, yes. So am I doing The Prisoner's Wife? Did we decide that? That's me,
sure.
Isn't it? Yes, I'm going to do it. Oh, no, you were doing Prisoner's Wife. Go for it.
I know, but I think you know it better.
You know what?
If you need me to.
I feel like I have an affinity to it because my husband's from the Czech Republic, and this book is set in wartime Czechoslovakia. And it's a story, it's actually based on a true story, even though it's written as a work of fiction. And it's the story of a British soldier who ends up being captured in Czechoslovakia under the Nazis. And as part of that, he's sent to one of the local communities to work in the farms, because the men are away fighting, and so they need some extra workers. And while he's there, he and one of the young Czechoslovakian girls fall madly in love, and they decide that they have to run away. And so she dresses as a man to run away with him, but unfortunately they're in Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia and they don't make it. So they get captured and they get sent to a male prisoner camp, where she maintains her disguise. And so the ordeal is just beginning. And so this is a book that just transports you into that world of young love, trying to survive under unimaginable circumstances. And it's an amazing story of a courageous young couple. And this one's called The Prisoner's Wife.
Prisoner's Wife. And that's out already.
Yes, that came out just at the end of May. And I am just looking up the author, by Maggie Brookes.
Maggie Brookes. Sounds wonderful. And I don't think we've looked a lot at Czechoslovakia during the war. Am I crazy? Or are there a lot of books that are set there?
Well, one that I do want to talk about a bit later is one of my personal picks. I can either do that now, or we can save that one for later. We're giving you a tantalizing.
Tantalizing, because I love that book as well. I love that. Yes, you're right. You're right. You're right. So what else do we have in literary fiction, like that strict category of literary fiction? Let's sit up straighter.
I know, right? Let's talk about literary fiction. Well, it's not beach read, but this book is called The Vanishing Hat. It's by an author named Bennett, and she wrote a book a few years ago called The Mothers, which I really enjoyed. And that late-breaking news has actually been optioned by Kerry Washington. So hopefully there'll be an adaptation of that sometime soon. But this book was our #1 most anticipated book by our audience for June. So that's huge. It revolves around two twin sisters who grew up in the South in the 1950s. One of them presents more as white, and the other is a little bit more dark-skinned. They're in a very tumultuous, kind of scary Southern community, and at the age of 16, they're actually able to escape. But 10 years later, the one who presents as white is living in California, and the other one who has a little bit darker skin actually has to return back to the Southern town in which they escaped earlier. They both have daughters, and then fast forward to the 1990s, and they're both separated, but the story revolves around sisters themselves, race relations, mother-daughter relationships. So as we sit up straighter, yes, this is a little bit more hefty, but our audience is loving this book. It came out on Tuesday, June 2nd, has well over a 4.0 average rating, and we expect really good, important things for this book.
Yeah, it sounds really, really interesting. Anything I've read about that one, I have it flagged to read. It's one of those, I have that flag to read and say, oh, I want to do that. I want to just interject here. How do you two read? I know you get probably advanced reading copies. Do you read on e-reader? Do you read on paper? Do you read and make notes and fold down pages like I do? Danny, tell me a little bit about how you read, what you do.
Okay, so I am, a bibliophile, as you can imagine.
And you file by color behind you.
I know, and that is very, people have feelings about that. But here's the major problem, or here's what people have, say they have beef with about colored bookshelves, I can't talk, is that they say, oh, how can you find your book, or where is your series? Well, I don't read many series, and I pretty much know any book spine you've got. So if anyone wants to quiz me behind me, I can find it pretty quickly. But I like paper, I prefer paper, and I read a mixture of advanced reading copies, ARCs, as well as older books. I have a terrible habit of buying 4 books at one time and reading one. So it's always important for me to read one book that I am excited about that's coming out, but then also return back to my bookshelf and be like, what's bubbling up right now? What should I be reading?
Yeah, that's me too. And sometimes, do you read more than one? Before I get to Suzanne, do you read more than one?
Yes, I do. I have a terrible habit of reading like 10 at once. So what I'll do is I'll read a chapter of one, then I'll read a chapter of another, read a chapter of another. So what ends up happening is it takes me a long time to read a book, but in the course of a few days, I'll finish 4.
Exactly. Pacing yourself in different ways.
Exactly.
And then you keep lists of what you've read? If you're reading far in advance, do you keep lists so that you have notes of what's going on, or do you just remember?
I track everything on Goodreads, goodreads.com. No, I use our want to read functionality. I do sometimes make little stickies of books that I want to make sure that I remember to read. But, Goodreads is how I track.
How you track and how you read.
Yeah.
Suzanne, how about you? Are reading more than once? Tell us what your habits are like.
Actually, before I talk about my own personal experience, I should mention what the editorial corner of the Goodreads office looks like. They have this really, really long windowsill where they literally have the months of the year of which books are coming as the publishers send them in to be considered, etc. And then every month or so, there'll be okay, we're releasing, and they'll release out into the rest of the Goodreads team, and then we will run for the bookshelves so that we can read them as well. So it's my favorite corner of the office when we are in the office. I love being there. So for me, I read. So I'm the kind of person who has to read every day. I literally must read every day, and it's part of my going to sleep routine. I'll read, and that's my, I think there's a quote by Annie Lamott that you've kind of earned this time at the end of the day where it's like I can read now, and I definitely feel like that. I read ebooks and print books. I love reading on my Kindle, particularly when I am reading nonfiction where I'm trying to learn something. I can do some really good Kindle notes and highlights that then get shared on Goodreads, so I can have them to either add notes to them and access them later. So I actually really love that. I'll take books whichever way I can get them, really. Library books. The only ones I haven't gotten into are audiobooks. I'm not good at taking information in, just listening to it. I'm much more of a visual person. Some print books, I'll be doing the underlining, yep, same as you, like taking all the notes. But I try and capture the notes sometimes in my reviews on Goodreads as well. And I love, we also have this thing, sorry, a little bit of brag for Goodreads, but we have this thing called Your Year in Books on Goodreads, which is fabulous, that you can see a list of all the books that you read, and it's all beautifully laid out. And so there's this really nice trip down memory lane that is the virtual equivalent of running your finger along a bookshelf along the different books on it. You can actually see all of your books and what the ratings were.
Especially when you have ebooks, because what I find is if I've read an ebook, I don't remember because it's not up on the shelf. I have this little habit that this year I started to make little notes on the bottom of dates, and I cut them out like I'm in like kindergarten and glue and tape them to the bottom of the books. And then the pandemic happened and a bunch of books moved, and I'm like, no, you can't move. I've already made your little label. And they'll say, you know, Carol, we took such a book that's coming out in May and we're moving it to next year. And I'm like, I don't have a next year shelf. Where can I put the next year book? I'm not prepared for next year. So, but I do like, I have to say, I like the print arcs just because I can line up what I'm supposed to be reading. And then somebody called me the other day and they said, you know, my book's coming out in August. And I said, I'll be honest with you, that's a lifetime away right now. I'm still on June. I said, and this is the first year I'm not that far ahead, because I have to admit, when things started happening in March, I couldn't read. I had so much going on in my head on what to do that I was trying to, and I started a lot, but it wasn't having the same enthusiasm level. And then all of a sudden something happened and it was escape with the book. I'm fine. I'm like, you know, totally there.
So I need to ask on behalf of Bookreporter readers. Right. You read a lot at weekends. How many books do you read a week, roughly?
I can read 2 to 3 a week. I can read 2 to 3. If I'm on vacation, it could be a book a day. Like I will just pack a suitcase and have a book a day and go through it. I'm a very fast reader. When I was little, when I was in about 7th grade, my mom took me to a class for speed reading. And she said, you know, do you want to go take this course? And they tested me and they said, when did she finish the class? And I was already reading that fast. But I think I read, you know, some people, like when little children learn to read, they read words and they sounded them out. I just see blocks of text and I read like that. And my children do the same thing. And it was kind of funny when they were growing up, they, as a result, cannot pronounce some things because they never learned to sound them out. So it's epitome instead of epitome. It's little things like that end up happening. Yes. So I do read a lot. And some books I read parts of just because I hear they're bubbling up and I want to at least be familiar with them. But big reader, it's the escape. So let's say, speaking about escape, we've got some debut authors, and debut authors right now are in a really tough time because, you know, we're not having the tours like usual and people aren't about, you know, talking about usual. So do you have any debuts that you really want to tell us about? Because we feel that they deserve a lot right now.
Well, Danny,
you're exactly right.
Yeah, Danny, you talked about the most anticipated fiction. Why don't you talk about the most anticipated non-fiction book, which was in May, right?
That's exactly right. Our #1 most anticipated nonfiction book of May is Hollywood Park. And Carol, I know you talked to the author about this book recently, so I want to hear more about what you have to say than what I have to say. But, you know, it's the #1 most anticipated nonfiction book of May, like I said, and that for a debut author is almost unheard of. So clearly the advanced readers here were really loving this compelling story of this young boy who grew up in a cult. It's been compared to Educated in the Glass Castle. I can do a little bit of the synopsis, but I'd rather hear, Carol, kind of what your conversation with him was like.
Oh, he was fantastic because what he did in writing this book, and I think that the story is wonderful, but his craft of putting together the book was what was really interesting. It begins with the tone and voice of writing as a child. And as a result, it's a very childlike childlike language and the way the child sees the world, and the voice continues like that as he matures and gets older. And what I felt was, by doing that, he wasn't presenting that he was 6 and knew everything. He was showing you what he saw at 6. When some violence happened, he was explaining how a 6-year-old or 7 or 8-year-old would see violence. So as a result, you're very much inside his head as you're reading the book, which I haven't seen with a lot of memoir. It's this looking back kind of a thing. But here you knew as much as he knew at that point. And when he was talking about his mother's depression, he was calling Russian something or other because he didn't know those words. He didn't know what was going on. Him learning to see his father for the first time, and in the cult they had been taken away from their parents, and he learns what a father is, what a man is in your life like that. And as he goes on, though, what I really love about the book is he gets into exploring himself. And he realizes that he has attachment issues. Like, he'd meet a girl and he'd want to marry her tomorrow and it'd be a deep relationship just because of what he'd been through personally. And I just find there are a lot of people that will sit and write a book like this, and they'll look back and there'll be a little bit of woe is me, a little bit of this, and he is just sitting there like, I have this wonderful life. And parts of this whole thing with my dad at Hollywood Park, with the horses, it was these great days. And he describes that day, and you're completely in the park with him and feeling what's going on. And I just feel like he did something different too. Is he's a musician. He has a band, Airborne Toxic Event, and he actually created an album that is a companion to this book. And if you listen to it on audio, he has audio clips. He narrates the audiobook, and he has audio clips throughout. But what's really wonderful is, if you listen to this, I have never heard an album as a companion to a book. So a movie has a soundtrack. This is the soundtrack of the book. And it's just, it's just from the heart. And the interview we did with him, it was just like I was talking to somebody I knew really well. And we'd met each other twice, but we never had lunch. We never had a conversation. So I'm glad to hear that it was a memoir. Nonfiction is something that bubbled up with readers so well. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, you sold it to me. I think I'm going to do it on audio.
I think you know what, actually, I've read it. I read an early copy. And interesting about the book, I got so much out of it that usually I reread for the interview. I started and I always remembered scenes very, very vividly. So I didn't have to do that. But I've asked them for the audio. I definitely want the audio because I want to hear him reading and be able to do that. I'll share something really funny about audio. When the pandemic happened in March, I used to drive into the city every day. So I had the Greer Hendricks, Sarah Pekkanen book in the car, right? So I got in the car the other day. My son was with me and he goes, wait, she still didn't get away. It's 2 months later. We realized we haven't been listening to the book. So I'm on 9, finally, but it's now taken me 3 months to get that far. And I got in the car the other day and I'm like, whoa, oh, here we are. We're back again with them. So I think that when we're talking about, audio and what people are doing, I had to switch to read some books on ebook because that's the only way I could get the galley right now. And I think that, are you seeing anything from readers about how they're changing their patterns? Have you seen anything like that? I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, of people trying audio more or anything?
Audio was already growing. So that's not changing as a result of the changing circumstances. Audio has been huge, as you know, over the last few years, and has really become this huge growth opportunity for publishers. So we haven't seen anything change on that front, no.
Right. Okay. And nothing but ebooks being more just because they can't get what they want at the library. Or seeing
not from what we're seeing. I mean, people can get ebooks through their libraries, of course, with Overture. No, I'm going to forget.
There were a number of
Overdrive.
There are a number of different
Overdrive. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you haven't discovered that option, that's a fun one. But now the queues are a whole lot younger on that one. We haven't seen from the data that we have on Goodreads any changes in terms of the type of the format of the books that people are reading.
Very, very interesting. That's a huge audience to see that kind of data about. So Suzanne, what else do you have for us?
Well, another great debut, which has been really winning a lot of fans, it's coming out on June 16th, is Saving Ruby King by Katherine Adel West. And this is set in the South Side of Chicago within the African-American community. And it's a young woman who's determined to protect her best friend while a long-buried secret threatens to unravel both of their families. It opens, I just started it last night, just the same as you, to get a feel for it, as I was going to be talking about it. And it starts with Ruby King's mother being found murdered in their home. and the police are just dismissing it as another act of violence in the Black neighborhood. And so Ruby now is ending up living at home with her father. Well, her father's very violent and has been beating the mother for years. And now Ruby is alone with him. And her friend, who's the daughter of a pastor, is trying to protect her and help her. But Layla's father, the friend, the pastor of the church, demands that Layla stays well away from that family. And the question becomes, why? And what's really interesting is the backstory about the author here. She herself is the daughter of a pastor and was raised in the South Side of Chicago. And although it's a work of fiction, she said, Katherine Adel West has said that it's very much based on her family. She's drawn a lot of Layla's family from her own experiences. So if you're looking for a great book club pick, this is a really good one. It's super meaty, and there's so many different layers to uncover and unpack.
And you know, a lot of people have been talking about what's happening during the pandemic right now with violence in homes and what has been happening with this, because children are not being reported. They're not going to school. You know, I saw in the news the other night, there's a code word that women can use so that the police will come to their homes at this point if they're in danger. So it's all these things that you weren't really thinking about before. That's, you know, how is this happening as well? So very, very interesting to be thinking about this. Absolutely. So Danny, what else do you have for us?
I have another debut. It's much lighter than that. So if you're, again, going back to the escape thing, the debut author here is Natalie Jenner. And I kind of like the mystery pick that I had earlier. I love her author story. So this is someone who's been writing for a really long time, had finished 5 books and tried to get each of them published and wasn't able to. So her and her husband decided to open a bookstore. And right around that time, her husband was diagnosed with cancer. So sadly enough, they actually closed the bookstore so she could help care for him. And during that time, she returned to the works of Jane Austen as just a sense of comfort. And this is actually a trend that we started seeing in the beginning of March too, when the pandemic hit. People just really gravitating to those books that they've loved, found comfort in, you know, those kind of, you know, comforting rereads. So she dived into the work of Jane Austen, and doing so, she learned about this real life Jane Austen Society. And as soon as her husband recovered, she decided to write about it. It's a group that is in England, and, you know, obviously they love Jane Austen's work, and it's a fictional account of them trying to save her estate right after World War II. Her estates and their community. And they all gather around her work and this estate and use it to heal from the wounds of the Second World War. Hugely popular with our audience. And one of our editors read it and loved it.
I know the editor, and he sent it to me early, like really early, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but hearing her backstory, now I want to read it all the more. It's on my pile, but moving up very, very quickly. Keith will be very happy to hear that. And actually, it's one of our summer reading titles that we're giving away as one of our summer reading. We have a dedicated newsletter that goes out that people could win one of 5 books every day, and it's one of them. So definitely readers are going to be buzzing about that as well on our sites. So Suzanne, what else do you have?
So I have another debut book called Daughters of Smoke and Fire by Ava Horner. And if you liked The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, this could be one that's really interesting for you. It takes readers into the everyday lives of Kurds. Now, the Kurds are a homeless people, and they are about 25 to 35 million of them. And they live in this mountainous region that's bordered by Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq, and Armenia, but no country of their own to call their home. And this is a story about a young woman called Layla, who's an ambitious young Kurdish girl. She dreams of going to university, and she wants to study to be a filmmaker and tell stories of her oppressed people and help people understand what they're going through. But then her younger brother, who's also from the similar activist bent, gets into trouble and he disappears. And so the story is this powerful and moving story about resilience. And it's one that you're going to be thinking about for a long time afterwards. So Daughters of Smoke and Fire by Ava Homa.
And it's funny, looking at the title of that, I wouldn't think that that was what the book was going to be about. I would think it was like it has like that YA kind of title. And It's such an intrigue. Like you're saying that, and now I want to read it because it's reminding me of In the Shadow of the Banyan that came out years ago. That I absolutely, is that a good comp for it? Is that a good, like, because she was in Cambodia.
Right, I think so. I think it's one of those ones where you learn, where you go into a different culture and country and learn and experience what's actually going on with those communities. So yeah, I think there's the similarities there.
Ooh, I'm really. I'm looking forward to it now. And I'm like, wait a second, I wanted to skip that. I might have skipped.
Yeah, and it was one of those ones. It was one of those ones that you and I had talked about, where we're trying to. There's a lot of books out there that everybody's talking about, and what we wanted to do with this podcast is kind of bring up a few more voices and give a bit more space, so that we can all go, wait a minute, there's more books out there than the 10 to 20 that are generally being talked about each month. So this is one of them.
And it's like peeling back the layers of what's interesting to the readers, or trying to send people in a different direction, because there are so many expected things that you could read, but then there's so many that I remember reading The Shadow Banyan years ago, and I've never thought about that part of the world the same way again. And I like books like that, where you're going to say, I understand that experience. Last year I had that with Beekeeper of Aleppo, and understanding what people were going through escaping Syria. And those stories, even though I can't remember the characters' names and I can't remember everything that happened, I feel a feeling when I think about them that I relish, and I relish having it be part of my life. So
that's what I love about reading these kinds of books as well, because you start to have an affinity. And so when those news stories come on about the Kurds, instead of it just being this nameless, faceless, suddenly you have something that makes it real to you. And I think that's the power of books, right? We're able to build those connections.
Yeah, able to do that. And I think that becomes really, really huge, because I think that too many times, there are different periods in history that we hear a lot about. We'll hear a lot about World War II. We'll hear a lot about, World War I. But there's so many other things that are happening. And, what we think about when I went to school, we studied a lot about Europe. But meanwhile, so much is happening in Asia, and so much is happening in other countries of the world right now that we know a lot about from just one perspective. But for a long time when we were in school, we weren't talking about the war in Japan. We were talking about the European conflict. And now I think that readers are reading more broadly as a result, and learning about a lot of things very, very differently. So are there any World War II books we should be thinking about? Is there anything unexpected there? New there?
There's two we can definitely talk about. So the first one is another debut, and this one's called The Women with Silver Wings: The Inspiring True Story of the Women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II. It's by Katherine Sharp Landdeck. It came out in April, so you can get it immediately. I cannot resist stories of trailbreaking women in industries or in areas where women are never allowed or are treated, with sexism, etc. And some of the stories in the Second World War, the code breakers, the resistance leaders, there are some amazing stories. And this one is about some brave trailblazing women who were the first to fly in the US military. And what they did was they realized that we have to ferry planes around the country. They get built in one area, but then we've got to get them to the Air Force Base in another area. And so what the women said were, we can do that for you, and the men can go and be on the front lines. How can we help? How can we help? This could be one way. And by the way, they didn't only just ferry planes around the country. They would also test planes. Can you imagine being a test pilot? Like after they were fixed, it was like, yeah, go up and make sure it's actually fixed. I can't believe people do that. And then another thing they used to do they would actually fly around the place with a target practice flying behind them, so that soldiers could practice their target practice. I'm like, what?
Crazy.
What would we do? What would we do?
And these women were incredible. And sometimes they would be flying in open cockpits in the freezing cold. I mean, it was unbelievable, the conditions they went through and where they were living. And by the way, in those days, you would be given anywhere from 5 to 20 hours flying practice, and then being told, yeah, you can go up by yourself and things like this. But what was, so much sexism, it was untrue. For example, they were considered civilians the whole time, not part of military service. And so there was an example where one died with her instructor, and the instructor, his family got $10,000 benefits and full military funeral. Her family got $250.
Wow.
And no funeral. And it was just unbelievable, the differences, even though they were doing essentially the same role. And so it wasn't until many, many years later that they were actually recognized. I think they were in their 70s and 80s before it started to be recognized. The author herself, this has been a labor of love for her. She actually first came across these people about 20 years ago at an air show. She met one of them and she was like, I've never heard of them. How come I've never heard of them? And she herself was an aspiring pilot, so she had this affinity with them. And so she got to know them all and tells their stories, and you get to know some of the characters. So if you're looking for inspiration and a way to honor these women by reading about and knowing about what they did, this is a great book. So The Women with Silver Wings.
And then you can read that up against The Huntress from Kate Quinn, which talked about the German flyers during World War II. So if you read the both, you'll have a different perspective on how the Americans were treated compared to what happened with the Germans. Just another thing to, kind of think about.
Yeah.
Any other debuts that you're crazy about, Suzanne?
Yeah, there's one more, which talking about how we said, thinking about different countries, etc. This one's flying below the radar, and you and I also talked about this one, and it was because it had to have its publication date moved out, and so we want to give some space here. The premise of this one is so intriguing. Danny and I were talking about it earlier this morning, and both of us were like, ooh. It's called What's Left of Me Is Yours by Stephanie Scott, coming out on June 23rd. And it's set in Japan. Now, in Japan, they have this weird rule that if you're getting divorced, if you are deemed to be the guilty party, then you don't get anything. You don't get control of the children or anything. Mm-hmm. And the person who has control of the children can decide whether or not to ever let you see them again. And so it becomes this crucial thing to be not seen as the guilty party in a divorce. And so what's happened is a whole covert industry has grown up around this and it's called the Wakaresa Seiya, and I probably butchered that, and I apologize to all Japanese people.
I thought that sounded really good. I thought I wouldn't be able to pronounce it.
And it means literally breaker upper. And it's a person who's hired by one spouse to seduce the other spouse so that they can then be the guilty party. It's a deliberate act of, the spouse has not done anything wrong, but I'm going to lead them into temptation. And so it's talking about this. It's set about 20 years ago, the original part of the story. And there's this guy called Sato. He hires one of these breaker-uppers to seduce his wife, Rina. Well, the problem is Rina and Kaitaro actually fall genuinely and madly in love. And they are then set on a course towards tragedy. And then 20 years later, Rina and Sato's daughter, gets a phone call that just blows everything up and reveals family secrets. And so people talk about this one being a slow burn read, but really mesmerizing and a fascinating look at Japan and its unique culture.
Now, I read this, I want to say around the holidays, maybe even before that. And what I really loved is I learned about something I didn't know about in the same vein that I would have learned about it from Lisa C. or Jean Kwok. Because you're going into a completely different place. Like you never think about the way women used to bind their feet, like this, where you would run and Google it. As soon as I was reading Stephanie's book, I was Googling to find out more about this, because it's something you don't know about, but it's big business in Japan. I mean, this is something that people are definitely doing to influence the settlement of marriages. And I just feel like I want to see this book do well with book groups. I want to see this book get its due. And it's so tough for a debut right now to be getting its kind of message. I'm hoping to interview her in a couple of weeks. She actually lives in London. And
wow.
Yes. So I really want to put together a conversation, which we tried to have in March when the book was coming out. I said, let's move it to now, because I'm so intrigued about how she found the subject and how she decided to write about it. So we'll stay tuned for more on that, but I'm glad we're talking about it, because I think it's one of those books that's going to be like here, and it should be like bubbling up higher.
Exactly. I mean, just the sound of it, we all then immediately go, ooh, wait a minute, I need to know more, right? You're desperate to find out what actually is happening here. So yeah.
What happened to those people? Well, we always are asked, like, what are the books that you are, like, what's your book of 2020? And people sometimes say to me, what are you reading that you really love? And I'm paralyzed. I'm like, I don't know. What do I really love? What's really good? What's really happening? Because I'm reading so much. And we have, on Facebook, we have a little town forum where we talk about what we're reading. And I'm always saying, well, it's coming out in 6 months, but I think you're going to really like this. And then just last week, somebody had brought up the Robert Kolker book. and Hidden Valley Road, and that they
yeah.
come out in, I guess, with March or April, or maybe my time we have no bearing on time.
Yes.
It came out during the pandemic. Let's just put it that way. And somebody wrote and said that book was really good. And I was like, oh wait, when did I tell them about that? Maybe I need to tell them about something that's actually out now. So tell us what you're talking to people about. Danny, what are you like raving about and telling everybody to read?
Okay, I am like you. I read a ton, and mostly I love most of the books I read. I trust Goodreads to tell me what people are loving, and I read books, and I'm a 4 to 5 star guy pretty much across the board.
Okay.
But this is the book, and I'll tell you the title in 1 second, that I devoured. And I haven't devoured a book like this since A Little Life, which I read like 5 years ago. And slight caveat, I did take last week off and I read it during my PTO. But the book is Curtis Sittenfield's Rodham. So this probably won't be for everyone, but if you think you're curious about learning an alternative Hillary Clinton, almost fan fiction, then this is probably the book for you. But it imagines a life in which Hillary Rodham doesn't marry Bill Clinton. And they date, they meet in college, they move to Arkansas, but they ultimately end up going their disparate paths. And she still finds her way into politics. And later, I won't ruin anything or reveal any twists, but Bill Clinton comes back in a very important way. And Donald Trump actually makes a really important cameo, and one that is very surprising. I read this book in 2 days. I loved it. I thought it was written so well. It's Curtis Sittenfeld, like I said. She wrote American Wife and Prep. I haven't read American Wife, but I've heard nothing but great things. Prep I did read and loved. If you think this book might be for you, I think you should pick it up.
Well, I read American Wife, so I was so interested when I heard she was doing this one, because I thought American Wife was fabulous. I mean, I love Prep, but what she did with American Wife and imagining Laura Bush's life, going into the whole story of what was going on there, I just think that she's got this talent. And when I heard this one was coming, it felt like kind of a drop-in, because we didn't hear about it very far in advance, but of when it was, moving far along in the process. But I have to admit that no matter where you stand politically, it's a very interesting way she puts together a story. So this is not a political, because everyone knows I stay away from politics on the site, but I'm telling you, the way this woman sits and looks at what these women's lives could be like and how they're with these very powerful men, or in this case, not with a very powerful man, and what ends up shaping their lives. I think she does a brilliant job of it. So I see why you would be excited about it. And it's one of those books that we've been hearing about, but we've probably been hearing about it more if we weren't locked in our houses.
Right,
so,
exactly.
So
I loved it.
And Suzanne, do you have one that you've been raving about?
I do. And I should tell a quick backstory, which is that there are silver linings for some of us, at least, on the being sheltered, the shelter in place. And mine is, I used to live in Australia for about 8 years. And so I have dear friends there. And so we all got in touch, remember that frenzy in March where everyone was doing Zoom calls and we were all just, are you okay? Connecting. Mine was definitely very international. And it was typical friends. We suddenly went, let's do a book club. So we have done a book club and we've read some amazing books. So about third book in, I pitched this book, which is When Time Stopped, a memoir of my father's war and what remains, by Ariana Neumann. And my friends loved it, absolutely loved it. And we were lucky enough to have Ariana actually come and do a Zoom call with us. And poor woman, we said 20 to 30 minutes, but we kept her for an hour and a quarter because there was so much to talk about. She was amazing. And she's in England, and the time zone thing was a nightmare. She was doing it at 10 o'clock at night, and my friends in Australia were up at 7 a.m. the next day. So let me tell you the story though. So this is set in the Second World War. Imagine you're a young Jewish man in Prague, Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia again, and the net is tightening. Your parents have already been sent away to Theresienstadt, which is one of the, it was a concentration camp, and the net is tightening on you, and you know that if they're gonna be sending you away pretty soon. And what do? What are your choices? And this young man called Hans Neumann made the audacious decision to say, I'm going to take on a false identity and I'm going to go to Berlin. I'm going to go to the belly of the beast and I'm going to work in a factory there. And just, it even, my skin, yeah, I'm getting goosebumps even just talking about it again, the audaciousness of going into Nazi Germany, to the capital, and going to work there. And miraculously, he does survive. He does it. The stories of people helping each other is incredible. And he survives, and he goes to Venezuela, and he ends up being very, very successful there. And Ariana is his daughter. And growing up, she was always this, she was always wanted a mystery to solve. And she was always trying to, you know, as a young girl, think of the secret societies and mysteries and all this kind of thing. And what she didn't realize was that the biggest mystery was about her father. Her father never talked about what happened to him. She never knew. She never knew. And she tried asking him towards the end, but he didn't want to talk about it. It was just too painful. But in the end, he left her a box of papers and letters and an identity card with him with a different name and a Nazi identity card. Not Nazi, but an identity card. And so then began this incredibly long journey where she starts piecing together and realizing that she had a whole family, most of whom died, were slaughtered in the Second World War. But it's this beautiful love letter to a father and the secret that he couldn't talk about. And it's an amazing book for a book club selection, as witnessed by my friends. And you can talk about how quickly freedom can be lost in a society, like hearing how the freedoms were gradually taken away and the restrictions put in place. It's the extraordinary courage of women trying to protect their families, some of the things they did to try and get food to their families, etc. And also ultimately the relationship between fathers and daughters. It's a beautiful book. I would love more people to be reading it, and I keep pressing it into the hands of different people.
You know, I heard her speak at a publisher lunch. Publishers will get together and have an author come in that they're passionate about, and they'll talk about the story. And I sat with her, and the story is so unbelievable about what she didn't know about her father. And she'd found that card early, and it was like, then the box disappeared. Like her father didn't want her to know while he was still alive. And there's some beautiful video online. If you Google her, I can't remember which press outlets did a story on her where actually she traveled to each of these places. And there's a picture of her father and there's a picture of her in these places. And when you think about what you know about your family and what you don't know, what she did not know all those years is just, and the impact it had on her, because she always knew that there was a secret in her family. She knew that something was being hidden. And I think that it's just that picking up of some kind of a verb of like what was going on in the family that I don't know about, but it absolutely had an impact on him. The way he behaved, he became very successful, everything, but there was this hidden, you know, behind of what was going on. Absolutely fascinating.
By the way, one thing that, because by reading about Hans, you just talking about affiliation, you know, he's one of our people, you know, you have this sort of sense of protectiveness and belonging about him. It was really funny though, because a month or two after reading the book, I was watching The Crown. And after each episode, I love to kind of research and all that kind of thing. And it was talking about Princess Margaret and going to Mystique, etc. And I was researching all that, and I was reading this amazing Vanity Fair story about it. And in the middle, just one little line, it said, and co-owner of Mystique, Hans Neumann. I went, Hans Neumann? Is that my Hans? And it is.
I know him.
And it is. He ended up being so successful in Venezuela that he ended up with Mystique and Princess Margaret. Yeah, not with Princess Margaret, sorry, before I make all sorts of rumors. But
you heard it here first, folks.
Breaking news.
I love it. I love it. So it's all those little things that, you know, I think that what I really enjoy about talking to you is that we hear these different stories and we hear the backstories that we love sharing with readers, because your conversation with her, you're talking about, oh, this is this background on the Jane Austen Society, those little stories, those kernels that can drive people to go want to read a book. And also hearing like what's bubbling up on Goodreads. I mean, many times I'm out there and I'm looking, I'm like, what are the ratings? Who are the pre-pub, kind of conversations about? Because I think as readers, we never want to miss anything that's great. And as a result, you know, you're sitting there talking about this, what Danny's been talking about. It's just so much fun to sit there and say, oh, these are these little kernels. You just made my reading pile a lot higher. And I was thinking I was doing June, folks, and now I've got to go back. I mean, seriously. You know? I have Ariane's book up here, but it was like February and like things were starting to erupt, and it was, And I
Yes.
think that what I want to make sure this year for people is that they don't miss a lot of books that happened in those months. And there were weeks that we all weren't reading. I mean, we just couldn't buckle down quite the same way. And I also I think I want to do a column somewhere about things you might have missed that you want to go back and do. And I think that maybe we could think about, like, how we're doing on our Goodreads pages to make sure nothing was missed of that we were reviewing, but people might not have been looking at quite the same way. And we're in a very strange year. I feel like 2020 has been a decade. So I had someone said the other day, they said, if you were an alien and you came, you'd leave and go to another planet. And I just thought that was like, this one's not for me. Yeah. Well, I thank you both for joining me today. This has been so much fun. As I said, I've expanded my reading list. I know our readers are going to as well. Can we do this again? Can we possibly schedule to do this again? Up for it?
It was so much fun. Absolutely. We'd love to. It's so great talking with you, Carol. It really is. And I love that you have an account on Goodreads as well, Bookreporter, where you can follow for a review, your fantastic reviews that you write through that account. So I love that you're such a big champion of books. I think it's wonderful.
Oh, thank you so much. And it's interesting because we have reviewers from all over the country. Some have been with us since we started 24 years ago. Wow. And as a result, and our editorial director, Tom Donadio, is amazing because he actually, like, sometimes we send out a spreadsheet, just how we do our processes. We send out a spreadsheet and ask them what they want to review. Nothing is assigned. And then if something isn't picked that I really want to make sure we reviewed, we usually hand pick who we want to have do it, knowing that they've loved this or they've loved that. And many times it's an extra book to ask them to read that month. But they said, you always put the right book in my hands. And it's just because we've gotten to know them so well. So when we started doing the Goodreads pages, we wanted to do them in specific genres. So instead of just everything on Bookreporter. And you were terrific in guiding us of, like, do your mystery thrillers, do the historical fiction, do it the way we were doing it, because I think that then we're guiding people the right way. You're not going to be surprised of, like, wait, what's that doing in the middle of the page? So absolutely wonderful. Well, I think we all should go start reading more. I think we should gather again. We'll make a date. And we'll have to sit there because, we only got up to June. We've got a lot more of summer to go.
No, exactly.
May I suggest wine next time?
Wine next time. Okay, I'll schedule for later in the day so you don't have to be day drinkers. I'm hearing there's I see cocktails all of a sudden in the middle of the day, and I'm like, wait a second, I know that editor. What is she mixing in the middle of the afternoon? Day drinking, it's a thing. We're home. So looking forward to much more conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. And to our readers, here's to next time.